Magic the Gathering is statistically the most complex card game in a very saturated hobby market. The game simplifies its massive card pool by boiling down into a variety of different formats, each with unique rules of card legality and deck construction criteria. By far the most popular format in Magic's history is Commander, also called Elder Dragon Highlander, or EDH for short, which involves building a deck of 100 cards, all themed around a singular legendary creature called your Commander. The format contains an incredibly diverse competitive range, with casual and competitive players alike enjoying the format for their own reasons. While the line between casual and competitive can become blurry at times, certain commanders have cemented themselves as being extremely casual, while others are widely recognized as bringing inherent strength simply by being in the command zone. In this video, I'm going to be covering 10 commanders who often find themselves in a very frustrating position, often being considered too strong for casual play while not being powerful enough to make it at the competitive tables. Before we get into the list, it's important to highlight that none of these commanders are illegal to play in either a competitive or a casual setting. Some of these commanders can and have seen play at a competitive level, but are often on the lower end of the spectrum and tend to be overlooked for far superior options. On the other side of the coin, it's important for commander players at any level to have a discussion before the game regarding what kind of experience the table wants to have. As long as your table is okay with you bringing out any of these commanders on the list, there's certainly no rule against it. These cards, just in general, tend to be viewed as problematic, as their combination of inherent power and simultaneous weaknesses cause them to straddle a difficult line between the two ideologies. Coming in at number 10 is Essex, Fractal Bloom. Essex is a 6-cost commander, costing 4, a green, and a blue for a 4/4 flyer. Each turn, the first time you would create a token, you may instead choose a creature other than Essex and make that many tokens that are a copy of the creature instead. Essex gets the number 10 spot for debatably being the lowest power entry on that list. But if built around even slightly, Essex can create insane power plays without much effort at all. The big issue coming from Essex involves how it interacts with other creatures who themselves make more tokens. Let's take a look at an extremely innocuous creature, Deep Forest Hermit. For 5 mana, you get a 1/1 creature with Vanishing 3 that creates 4 1/1 squirrel tokens when it enters the field. The way this interaction works, as long as you have Essex on the field when it enters, its trigger activates. When the 4 tokens would be made, you can instead choose to make 4 more copies of the Hermit. Those 4 Hermits then activate to make an additional 16 tokens, each of which receives an additional +5/+5 for each of your other 5 Hermits. This is just one example, but already you can see the insane power spike that simple plays can make. The explosive nature of the card can make it very frustrating to constantly have to police at lower tables, a theme we'll be seeing more of as we continue on with our list. In at number 9, we have Animar, Soul of Elements. Animar is a blue, red, and green 1/1 elemental costing 1 mana of each color. It has protection from white and black, and gets a +1/+1 counter each time you cast a creature spell. Your creatures also cost 1 less mana for each +1 counter on Animar. Now there are a couple of things that make Animar problematic, but the reason he holds such a low spot on this list is simply because he can and has seen competitive play. The problem is that in a competitive setting, Animar finds himself extremely vulnerable to interruption, making him a bit of a glass cannon. His combination of effects, however, make him so incredibly fast and powerful at lower tables that you have to actually try to make him bad in order to keep him from taking over games. As long as your deck contains a high density of creatures, the inherent ramping of his effect skyrockets the player into insane levels of mana advantage. One of the most common pairings with Animar are various colorless creatures, which can be played completely for free once he reaches the proper number of counters. Many of these creatures already straddle the line between casual and competitive, and Animar blurs that line even further. Even still, Animar could be a lot more tolerable if not for his protection effect, making him immune to damage or targeting by white or black cards. Since many of the best removal spells in the game tend to be in these colors, he can be incredibly difficult to keep in check once resolved. The problem with many Animar decks, though, is if you can keep him in check, often it's enough to put the player out of the game entirely. This feast or famine playstyle can be annoying both for the pilot and the table, who have to choose between letting the Animar player run the table or making sure they can't participate at all. Number 8 on the list goes to Chulane, Teller of Tales. Chulane is a 5-mana, 2/4 human druid with a mana cost of 2, a green, white, and blue. Chulane has Vigilance, and anytime you cast a creature spell, let you draw a card, then put a land from your hand into play. Additionally, for 3 mana, you can tap Chulane to return target creature you control to its owner's hand. Chulane is a classic example of a card design many players have taken big issue with over the last few years, featuring what's generally referred to as being the enabler stapled to the payoff. By playing creatures, Chulane immediately lets you draw more cards. If you draw lands, you can then play them for free, which lets you play more creatures, which lets you draw more cards. On and on, around and around. Chulane inherently having an effect that cyclically links both ramp and card advantage makes it very easy to take long, drawn-out turns, as there's always more that you can do. He has a very similar issue to Animar, where the deck is extremely reliant on keeping the commander in play, but if you can stick him, he is absolutely capable of a power level that can be considered competitive. The problem with Chulane in competitive EDH specifically is that better options exist. In the same colors, commanders such as Derevi and partner combinations like Kodama of the East Tree and Ashai, Ojutai Dragonspeaker, can be much scarier, which leaves Chulane on the bench aside from people who want to play him simply for the love of it. Still, Chulane's ability to not only build out an insane board state, all while continuing to advance the player's resources, make him a headache for anyone to see in a casual pod. Up next at number 7 is Gaddock Teague. Teague is a 2-mana, green and white, 2/2 Kithkin Advisor. While in play, non-creature spells that cost 4 or more, or have X in their play cost, can't be played. Teague is a perfect representation of why cards on this list exist in the limbo that they do. Teague has a habit of tying down casual tables where big, splashy spells are very commonplace, while simultaneously doing very little, if anything, at more competitive tables where hyper-efficient spells become the norm. While there are a few notable cards that are hampered by Teague in competitive EDH, in general, Teague is considered extremely mediocre. On the other hand, if you sit down at a casual table and pull out Gaddock Teague, you're likely to hear a groan from at least one of the people in the pod. Teague's effect only ties up non-creatures, so more creature-heavy decks may not even notice he's around. But even in those cases, it's not uncommon for a few big spells to be run simply for the fun of it. Teague affects everything from instants and sorceries to permanents like planeswalkers and artifacts. Since Commander tends to be the outlet for many casual players to play their big, overcosted cards in a setting that can support them, the addition of Teague to that environment can ultimately spoil the fun for a lot of people. And since even mass removal like board wipes tend to cost 4 or more mana, it can even make Teague a bit tedious to deal with if you don't pull the right answer at the right time. Smashing into the number 6 slot is Zakama, Primal Calamity. This massive creature is a 9-mana, 9/9 Elder Dinosaur, which, I mean, there aren't too many cooler creature type combinations than that. He costs 6, a red, green, and a white, and has Vigilance, Reach, and Trample. Whenever Zakama enters the battlefield, as long as it was cast, you can untap all of your lands. Additionally, Zakama has 3 activated abilities, each costing 2 generic mana and one of the 3 colors in its respective color identity. For 2 and a red, you can deal 3 damage to target creature. 2 and a green lets you destroy any artifact or enchantment, and 2 and a white gains you 3 life. This is a lot to take in, but basically, as long as you cast Zakama with lands, he refunds his full cost immediately by untapping all of them all over again. This frees up all of that mana if you'd like to use his 3 abilities, which boost your life total or control the board in various ways, all while being a chonky 9/9 body with 3 relevant combat abilities. The problem with Zakama is his entire goal is basically to control the entire board state. It can get annoying very quickly knowing that there's a Zakama in play with a minimum of 9 mana up, which is already 3 uses of his abilities. Keeping permanents in play becomes extremely tedious, and since the whole goal of Zakama is to ramp out mana advantage to abuse the effects anyway, it's unlikely that even if he's removed from the field that he's going to stay gone. Zakama tends to be the epitome of a Pubstomp Commander, absolutely brutalizing casual groups just trying to enjoy themselves while being way too slow and unproductive to last when people are trying to win the game as fast as possible. Coiling into number 5 is Coma, Cosmos Serpent. Coma is another great example of a big, splashy creature, being a 7 mana card costing 3 green, blue for a 6/6 Serpent. Coma can't be countered and creates a 3/3 coil token during each player's upkeep. By sacrificing another Serpent, which the coils are, you can either make Coma indestructible or tap target permanent and prevent it from using its effects for the rest of the turn. In a format that is most commonly played with 4 people, netting 4 coil tokens every turn cycle is already a lot to deal with. Coma is very much an army in a can style card, able to create entire board states single-handedly. While fairly popular in the decks of many Commander players, in the command zone, Coma can be a bit much to handle. Oftentimes, decks built around Coma are simply a pile of ramp, control, and card draw. Since Coma does so much on his own, why bother playing other win conditions? Especially when your win condition can't be countered and brings with it some built-in destruction protection as long as you can wait for a single turn to pass. Coma creates a bit of an arch-enemy situation, where he becomes the sole focus of the table in order to keep him from inherently scaling out of control just by existing on the field for several turns. Just like the other entries on this list, Coma isn't good enough to sit at the average competitive table either. A 7 mana commander is well outside of what most competitive EDH players would consider viable, and since he doesn't lend himself to any very abusable combos, the incremental board presence just doesn't end up being fast enough, leading to this incredibly cool but pub-stompy large snake being kept out of the command zone for many playgroups. Squirming into the number 4 spot is Toxril, the Corrosive. Toxril is a 7 mana, 7/7 slug horror, costing 5 black and black. However, since he has an effect containing a blue mana symbol, he's actually a black and blue commander. At the beginning of each player's end step, Toxril puts a slime counter on each creature you don't control, and while Toxril is in play, those creatures you don't control also get -1/-1 for each slime counter on them. Anytime a creature you don't control with a slime counter on it dies, you then create a 1/1 slug token. Finally, for a blue and a black mana, you can sacrifice a slug in order to draw a card. Toxril faces many of the same issues as Coma, being a 1-card army that can dominate the game all by itself. But what makes Toxril even more oppressive than the Cosmos Serpent is the fact that it keeps the board clear of creatures with each turn that passes. In a single turn cycle, the table collectively receives 4 slime counters, meaning any creatures that were on the field for that first turn, which had 4 toughness or less, are just dead. This form of removal also gets around hexproof, indestructible, protection, and virtually any other form of durability. You either deal with Toxril or your field is going down. And in their stead rises the Slug Hordes to make you regret ever daring to participate in the game in the first place. Toxril is another commander that needs to be kept off the board at all times or the game grinds to a halt. Having to hyper-police one player generally isn't a fun experience unless it's been agreed upon, and even then, Toxril packing a built-in card advantage engine means that even if you kick Toxril to the curb, it's pretty likely he's going to climb his way back in. Finding her way to the number 3 spot is Norset, Enlightened Master. Norset is 3 blue, red, and white for a 3/2 human monk with first strike and hexproof. Each time Norset attacks, you can exile the top 4 cards of your deck. Until the end of the turn, you can then cast any number of non-creature spells from that pile without paying their mana cost. A commander in blue and red that cheats the cost on non-creature spells. What could this ability possibly be used for? Unsurprisingly, Norset decks tend to be a massive pile of extra combat and extra turn spells. The goal is to attack once and then continue attacking until the table dies. Norset having hexproof makes her very difficult to interact with, and first strike makes her weirdly challenging to handle in combat as well, especially with cards like Eldrazi Conscription being one of the hallmarks Norset often brings to the table. Norset is a bit of a scourge. You tend to know exactly what you're in for when you see her pulled out of your friend's bag, but that doesn't make her any easier to stop. Not to sound like a broken record, but much stronger alternatives also exist if you want to go competitive. Krark and Sakashima are a tried and true partner combination for storming off in a competitive environment. Why pay 6 mana and still have to wait a turn for the attack? Moving on to number 2, we have Turgrid, God of Fright. Likely the most infamous commander on a list of infamous commanders, Turgrid has become the face of unfun decks to play against. For 3 black, you get a 4/5 god with Menace. Anytime an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent or discards a permanent card, you can put those cards into play under your control. Turgrid technically has a backside to the card as well, but it's highly unlikely that you're going to use it. The biggest issue with Turgrid is she really doesn't win the game so much as slow down the game to a horrendously unwinnable pace. The goal of a Turgrid deck is to slowly steal away little bits of advantage while making sure your opponents aren't left with any resources of their own, stealing lands, creatures, and anything else they were foolish enough to bring to the table. There are plenty of cards a Turgrid player can cast that most casual pods will scoop to immediately, simply out of disinterest in trying to claw back enough resources to play, much less win the game. Much like the other entries on this list, however, bringing Turgrid to a competitive game is asking for punishment. A commander that tries to slow the game down without actually pushing out a win condition isn't going to last very long, especially in a format full to bursting with cheap, efficient interaction. A 5-mana commander that still requires more spells to resolve, ain't it, Chief? Turgrid players have been searching for a pod to use her in since her release, and are all too familiar with the struggle of finding a good time or place to bring her out. And finally, sitting atop the limbo throne at number 1, we have Hokori, Dust Drinker. For 2 white, you get a 2/2 spirit creature with 2 effects. The first makes it so lands don't untap during their controller's untap steps, and at the beginning of each player's upkeep, they can untap a single land. Hokori is emblematic of the differences between casual versus competitive. There are a few unspoken rules that most casual players are assumed to follow when they agree they aren't playing a competitive game. And often, the biggest sin a casual player can commit is messing with the ability of the other players to participate in the game. This prevention generally takes 2 primary forms. One is stacks pieces, which restrict the ability of players to make specific actions, and the other is kind of an offshoot of stacks, which is land denial. While removal is not only commonplace, but encouraged for a healthy game experience, destroying or removing lands is a different matter entirely. Some cards like Wasteland, Strip Mine, and Ghost Quarter are sometimes run as answers to lands that can be particularly problematic, and are even encouraged so lands as a card type aren't completely untouchable. But mass land destruction is mostly considered a very big no-no. While Hokori and its artifact equivalent Winter Orb may not technically destroy lands, The ability to cut off all but one of a player's lands every single turn is incredibly backbreaking and unfun. Having access to that effect in the command zone, where it can never be properly dealt with, even more so. Generally speaking, if you're building Hikori, you're probably going to be playing a lot of mana-producing artifacts, so the effect doesn't slow you down nearly as much. But a debatably worse alternative is Hikori decks that don't build to break the parity. The game can grind down to a halt, with no one being able to cast spells, at which point, what is the point? Casual EDH is meant to be a social experience. Everyone sat down with their own unique deck and a game plan in mind, but it's hard to accomplish that goal when you can't cast anything. So why isn't Hikori having the same effect in competitive EDH? Simple. Lands aren't nearly as valuable of a resource. In casual EDH, lands are the primary source of mana for most decks you're likely to come up against. In competitive, the format circulates around what's referred to as fast mana, which is strictly designed to speed up the course of the game. While some decks still utilize lands as a source of value, the vast majority of decks in the format are going to be reliant on alternative resources, like mana-generating creatures and artifacts. It's not uncommon for games of cEDH to end with players only having 1 or 2 lands in play total, so Hikori isn't really doing anything. It basically doesn't have any relevant text. So why play a 4-mana do-nothing when Mono White also has access to powerful commanders like Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, which taxes the non-creature spells much more prominent in the format, or even Kataki, War's Wage, a card which ironically would have significantly less value at a casual table, but puts the squeeze on the more common mana resource in cEDH, especially decks that want to generate treasure tokens. If Hikori is a favorite card of yours, I feel for you. The design of a sentient sandstorm is really cool, and the artwork options available are very nice to look at, but he really doesn't have a good home outside of strictly agreed upon tables, and is absolutely not a commander I would recommend bringing out without discussing it first. A tragic fate for truly a very cool card. And that's going to do it for this top 10. Each of these commanders actually have very cool designs, but they sadly exist in the limbo of being too good to be bad and too bad to be good. If any of these are commanders you are interested in building, you absolutely should. Just be sure to have the conversation before beginning a game so everyone at the table knows what to expect and everyone can still have a great time. If you guys enjoyed this top 10 and want to see more, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss my next upload. With that, I am an avid herpetologist. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and I will see you all next time.